There is a ship at the bottom of the Aegean Sea that should not be disappearing this fast. It did not sink in the freezing North Atlantic like its more famous sister. It sank in water warm enough to swim in, shallow enough to dive, close enough to the surface that sunlight still filters down on clear days. And that is exactly the problem. HMHS Britannic, the largest Olympic-class ocean liner ever built, bigger than Titanic herself, struck a mine on the 21st of November, 1916, and sank in just 55 minutes. Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes. Britannic was gone before most people had time to process what was happening. Over 1,000 survived. But what has happened to that ship in the century since is a different story entirely. Britannic is not sitting on the seafloor waiting to be found. It is being consumed actively, continuously, and at a rate that has alarmed every researcher who has studied it seriously. And the reason has almost nothing to do with bad luck. It has everything to do with where it landed and what that location refuses to stop doing. Most people assume that deeper means more dangerous for a shipwreck, more pressure, more cold, more darkness. And in terms of survival, that is true. But in terms of preservation, the opposite is often the case. And Britannic is one of the most extreme examples of why. The wrecks that survive best are frequently the deepest ones. Titanic rests at roughly 3,800 meters in the North Atlantic, where temperatures hover just above freezing. Oxygen exchange is minimal, and the extreme pressure creates an environment where many biological and chemical processes simply cannot function efficiently. Decay still happens down there, but it happens slowly, constrained by the limits of the system around it. That system, in a meaningful sense, has partially switched off. Britannic sits at approximately 120 meters. That sounds deep by human diving standards, and it is. But in oceanographic terms, 120 meters is what researchers call the mesopelagic zone, a transitional layer where light still penetrates faintly, where temperatures remain stable but not suppressive, and where biological and chemical activity remains surprisingly robust. This is not a dead zone. It is one of the most metabolically active layers in the entire ocean column, and this system has no intention of slowing down. What this means for Britannic is that it does not have the protection that depth would normally offer. The system around it has never truly shut down. The water circulates continuously. Oxygen remains dissolved and available. Bacteria and microorganisms that would be inactive in colder, deeper water remain fully operational. The ship landed in a location where nearly every system capable of breaking it down was ready and waiting and has been running, without interruption, for over a century. Researchers who have studied wrecks across different depth ranges have noted again and again that Britannic's rate of structural deterioration outpaces sites in far harsher environments. The Aegean at 120 meters is harder on steel than the deep Atlantic. This should not be true, but it is. And the deeper you look into why, the more clearly a single answer begins to form. This environment refuses to reach equilibrium. It never has. Steel does not simply rust underwater. What happens to iron in a marine environment is far more complex than the surface discoloration most people picture, and at 120 meters in the Aegean, every condition required to accelerate that process exists simultaneously and without interruption. Where oxygen is freely available, iron oxidation proceeds continuously. Exposed metal surfaces are stripped of electrons, and iron ions migrate into the surrounding water, weakening the material at a molecular level that is invisible until it is not. The ship does not look like it is dissolving, but it is, slowly and steadily, and then all at once, when a weakened section can no longer support the structure above it. What makes this worse, significantly worse, is what happens inside enclosed spaces. In compartments that are partially blocked or obstructed, oxygen does not replenish as quickly. As aerobic bacteria consume what is available, oxygen levels fall. And in those low oxygen zones, a completely different class of bacteria takes over. Sulfate-reducing bacteria thrive in anaerobic conditions, and they produce hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide reacts with iron in ways that are slower to observe but faster to destroy. It does not attack the surface. It penetrates the material, moving through the metal structure from within. Areas that appear intact from the outside can be catastrophically weakened on the inside with no visible warning until the moment of collapse. This is where containment fails at the chemical level. Britannic is not degrading uniformly. It is degrading through a patchwork of competing chemical environments, some aggressive and visible, others invisible and far more dangerous. The ship is being attacked from the outside and from within, simultaneously, through entirely different mechanisms. This system should not be able to sustain that level of activity at this scale. But here, it does. And the reason it does is that nothing in this environment is switching off. One of the most disorienting realizations that comes from studying this wreck is that the ocean has not simply surrounded the ship, it has redesigned it. Not physically, the steel is where it fell, but functionally, the architecture of Britannic has been completely repurposed, and the engineering principles that defined it have been inverted. Britannic was built to separate spaces. Watertight compartments, sealed bulkheads, controlled corridors. The entire philosophy of the Olympic-class liners was about maintaining internal order against an unpredictable external environment. That philosophy held for 55 minutes after the explosion. On the seafloor, it became the mechanism of the ship's own undoing. External currents passing over the wreck create pressure differentials that pull water through every available opening. Corridors designed for passengers become directional flow channels. Stairwells that once connected decks now function as vertical conduits for water moving between pressure zones. Compartments built to hold air become temporary reservoirs, filling and flushing as gradients shift with tidal changes and seasonal current patterns. The system does not ask permission. It establishes pathways where pathways are possible, and then it expands them. This is where stability fails at the structural level. There is no sealed pocket where decay cannot eventually reach. There is no compartment isolated long enough to reach chemical equilibrium. The ocean has converted every engineered boundary into a flow pathway. And once flow is established, every surface within that path is continuously exposed to the full chemical and biological activity of the surrounding water. The separation that was designed to protect the ship is now the mechanism by which it is most thoroughly penetrated. So why is this happening faster here than in comparable wrecks in other regions? The answer lies in what the Aegean does not do. It does not close the system. Cold, deep water would slow circulation and eventually suppress the exchange. Here, the currents remain active, the temperature remains stable, and the gradients that drive water movement never fully dissipate. The architecture of the ship has been absorbed into the architecture of the ocean, and the ocean does not build things, it passes through them. Sediment sounds passive. It sounds like burial, like slow accumulation, like the ocean gently covering what it has claimed. But sediment in this environment is not passive at all. It is one of the most active, system-altering variables operating on the wreck, and its effects are almost entirely invisible from the outside. Fine particles suspended in the water column drift into the structure wherever flow slows enough to allow deposition. They collect in low-energy zones, corners, deck recesses, the inner edges of collapsed sections, and they begin to build up. As they do, they absorb dissolved oxygen in the immediate vicinity. Even a thin layer of sediment accumulation is enough to create a localized anoxic environment directly beneath it, separated by only a few millimeters from the oxygenated water above. Metal surfaces buried under that thin layer experience a fundamentally different chemical environment than metal exposed to open water. The oxygen depletion at the sediment interface creates exactly the conditions that sulfate-reducing bacteria need to establish themselves and begin operating. Accelerated decay occurs not at the visible surface of the wreck, but at the sediment boundary, a zone that is impossible to assess from a distance and requires direct physical inspection to detect. At the same time, sediment accumulation blocks flow pathways, rerouting water circulation, and changing oxygen distribution throughout the interior. A compartment that previously received steady oxygenated flow can be partially sealed by sediment over the course of years, transitioning from aerobic to anaerobic chemistry and shifting to an entirely different mode of degradation. The bacterial populations change, the chemical reactions change, the rate and character of structural damage change, and none of it is visible until a survey team gets close enough to see it directly. Sediment does not bury Britannic. It continuously rewires it, redistributing the conditions for decay, creating new microenvironments, and expanding the total area under active chemical attack. What appears to be passive accumulation is, in fact, active system reconfiguration, and it never stops. Here is the part that took researchers the longest to fully appreciate. The force destroying Britannic most efficiently is not the ocean chemistry alone. It is the ocean biology operating on top of that chemistry, amplifying it, directing it, and sustaining it at levels that the chemistry could not maintain on its own. Biofilms, thin layers of microbial communities, colonize every exposed metal surface within days of a wreck forming. These are not passive colonies. They are electrochemically active, drawing energy directly from the iron they inhabit. Iron-oxidizing bacteria essentially breathe the corrosion process, using the energy released by iron oxidation to fuel their own metabolism. In doing so, they accelerate corrosion far beyond the rate that dissolved oxygen and seawater chemistry alone would produce. This is not decay as erosion. It is decay as a directed biological process. These biofilms also modify the local chemical environment. They alter pH levels and oxygen concentrations at the surface of the metal, producing microclimates that concentrate corrosion in specific zones and penetrate deeper into the material over time. This produces the rusticle formations that have become iconic in deep wreck documentary footage. Long, fragile iron oxide stalactites hanging from structural elements, visually striking and biologically active. Rusticles are not just corrosion products. They are living structures, housing complex microbial communities that continue processing iron within them. When they detach and fall, they take structural material with them, and they fall regularly. What is sustaining this level of biological activity after more than a century? The same thing that has sustained it from the beginning. The Aegean at this depth provides a continuous supply of dissolved oxygen, dissolved minerals, and stable temperature, everything these communities need to remain metabolically active indefinitely. This system should not be able to maintain this level of output at this scale and for this duration, but it does, because this environment has never given it a reason to slow down. The biological layer is not a secondary effect. It is one of the primary drivers of Britannic's disappearance, and it has been running continuously since the first week of December 1916. Of all the variables governing how quickly Britannic degrades, oxygen distribution is the most consequential and the least predictable. It is the central regulator of the entire system, and it does not stay still. Oxygen levels inside the wreck vary enormously depending on location, depth within the structure, degree of enclosure, and the current state of water circulation. Areas open to the surrounding sea receive continuous replenishment and sustain rapid oxidation and dense biological communities. Areas that are enclosed or obstructed gradually become oxygen depleted, transitioning into anaerobic chemistry where sulfate-reducing bacteria dominate. These two regimes produce very different kinds of damage. Both are actively destructive, and the boundary between them is never fixed. Seasonal changes in Aegean current patterns shift water flow through the wreck, temporarily oxygenating compartments that were previously anoxic and cutting off oxygen to sections that had previously received it. When oxygen is reintroduced into an anoxic zone, it does not stabilize the system. It triggers a new burst of aerobic microbial activity in a compartment already compromised by anaerobic chemistry. The result is not preservation, it is acceleration. The system does not progress in a straight line. It reorganizes itself in response to every shift in conditions, and each reorganization opens new pathways for damage. Structural collapses amplify this further. When a section of decking gives way, it opens new channels for water movement, exposing previously sealed areas to oxygenated circulation and triggering new cycles of degradation in zones that had reached a temporary, fragile pause. Each collapse is both an effect and a cause. The more the system changes, the faster it becomes capable of changing again. This is where predictability breaks down entirely, and this is why the rate of visible deterioration has not slowed after 100 years. It has not slowed because the system driving it has not slowed. Equilibrium is not a destination this environment is capable of reaching. It is easy to talk about chemistry and biology and pressure gradients and forget that this ship carried people, real people in a real war, in a real emergency that unfolded faster than anyone around them was prepared for. Violet Jessup was on board that morning. She had survived the sinking of Titanic 4 years earlier, and before that, she had been aboard Olympic when it collided with a British warship in the Solent. She was impossibly present for all 3 major disasters involving the Olympic-class liners, and she survived all 3. She later described the sounds of Britannic going down, not the explosion that caused it, but the mechanical groaning of a ship losing structural coherence, the sound of water taking over spaces designed to be sealed against it, and the silence that came too quickly after. Many of the 1,036 survivors owed their lives to a detail that the disaster itself revealed as a critical flaw. Britannic's portholes had been left open for ventilation. It was a hospital ship, and patients required fresh air. As the ship listed, those open portholes allowed water to flood compartments faster than the pumps could compensate. 2 lifeboats were lowered before the propellers stopped turning. They were pulled into the blades. The people inside them did not survive. The wreck at 120 meters still holds evidence of those 55 minutes. Personal effects drifted into positions that matched the angle of the sinking and have remained there. Medical equipment is still present in compartments that were sealed quickly enough to preserve the distribution of objects within them. Structural deformations reflect the violence of the sinking itself, not the slow reshaping of a century underwater. 2 separate timelines are written into the same steel, the event of 1916 and the transformation that followed it. And this is where the human story and the system story converge. What happened in 55 minutes in 1916, the flooding of compartments, the failure of containment, the rapid intrusion of an external system into a sealed internal one is now being replayed in slow motion by the ocean itself. The same boundaries that failed that morning are being dissolved systematically by the same force that first breached them. The ocean did not finish in 55 minutes. It simply changed its pace. In 2024 and into 2025, Britannic has attracted renewed scientific attention, and the urgency behind that attention has intensified considerably. The rate of visible structural change observed between expeditions has increased. Sections that appeared stable in survey footage from a decade ago have collapsed or significantly deformed in more recent assessments. The bow, which retained much of its recognizable original geometry for decades, now shows stress fractures and structural buckling that researchers had not projected to appear this soon. The question this raises is the same one that has defined the study of this wreck from the beginning. Why hasn't it slowed down? A system under continuous chemical and biological attack should, in theory, gradually deplete the conditions sustaining that attack. Reactive iron surfaces should become passivated. Microbial communities should reach carrying capacity. The environment should move towards some kind of dynamic balance. At 120 meters in the Aegean, that process of stabilization does not appear to be occurring. The degradation is not decelerating. In measurable terms, it is accelerating. The answer connects back to every earlier layer of the system. The Aegean continuously replenishes oxygen through seasonal circulation. Sediment redistribution constantly creates new reactive interfaces. Structural collapses repeatedly introduce oxygen into previously anoxic zones, restarting cycles that might otherwise have stabilized. The system feeds itself. Each change produces the conditions for the next change, and no single process ever consumes itself to exhaustion before being reinitiated by another. This has implications that extend well beyond one ship. Britannic is a case study in what happens to steel structures in a moderate depth, biologically active marine environment, a category that includes thousands of wrecks, offshore infrastructure installations, and submerged pipelines across the world. Understanding why this system refuses to slow down is not an academic question. It has direct engineering relevance for structures that were built with the assumption that the ocean, given time, would eventually reach a stable relationship with what it surrounded. That assumption, in environments like this one, is incorrect. Stand inside a narrow interior passage of Britannic, deep within the hull, and nothing immediately suggests failure. The geometry of the corridor appears intact. The steel walls still hold their original angles. The engineering of 1914 seems, for a moment, to have survived. But the walls are not solid. They are hosting microbial communities that process iron molecule by molecule, continuously, without pause. The floor has shifted under the redistribution of sediment that has rewired the chemistry directly beneath it. The water moving through that corridor is not resting water. It is part of a circulation system that carries dissolved iron out of the structure on every current cycle and returns oxygenated water on the next. What looks like preservation is not preservation. It is the final stage before the moment when the structure can no longer hold its shape. Britannic was not weakly built. It was one of the most advanced ships of its era, designed with direct lessons from Titanic, fitted with a double hull and extended watertight compartments. It was built to survive, and in the short term, it did long enough for over 1,000 people to get off alive. It was not undone by its design. It was undone by where it landed. The Aegean, at 120 meters, is not a harsh environment in the way the deep ocean is harsh. It does not crush. It does not freeze. It does not suppress. What it does, and what it has been doing without interruption for over a century, is refuse to stabilize. The temperature holds, the oxygen replenishes, the currents keep moving, the biology keeps feeding. Every system that is capable of breaking down complex iron structures remains fully active, fully supplied, and fully engaged. This is not a place where processes slow down and reach accommodation with what they surround. This is a place where they remain permanently operational. Britannic is not disappearing because it was weaker than the ocean. It is disappearing because it landed in a system that never stops working. The ocean is not destroying the ship, it is learning how to absorb structure. Subscribe to Sunken Realms Deep, where history lies still beneath the waves.